This is an important conference, and it's been a great conference, and I think this is an important topic. And I say that not just because I'm a part of it, but because I think it really is essential for folks who operate in and around the space community to understand that there's a foundation for the fact that they're able to do that work. And that foundation in the world of a government-driven program, which we've had at NASA since the beginning until today, and will, I think, to some extent into the future. That's important to understand, and to understand that we're subject to that process. As has been mentioned, and as you have seen, I think, very, very clearly this week, the space community is evolving with the emergence of a lot of new capabilities, new private and public players, new concepts of operations for conducting research in space, and at the same time, the U.S. is amplifying private sector involvement on the National Laboratory and the future platforms that may come to be in low Earth orbit, allowing NASA to shift its emphasis towards deep space. The U.S. space policy process is at the same time experiencing an evolution of its own. A key part of that has been mentioned and described very well by Jared, and that's the establishment again of a National Space Council. And the subsequent reassignment of monitoring and regulation of commercial space activities and requirements to the existing, to review the existing regulatory impact and try to minimize that. And we're going to hear a little bit more about that. The Congress is a party to that. I always like to tell people when they talk about presidential space policy directives in the Congress, we say thanks for sharing. You know, we appreciate that input. I don't get smiles from the government, from the executive branch when I do that, but thank you, Jared, for being tolerant. But the point I'm trying to make in saying that is that it is a partnership. It is a two-pronged process. And, you know, the policy directives from the White House are key and critical. They have as much weight as in some ways more weight even than the policy proposal, the budget proposal, which embodies the president's policies as well. But in the end, the president proposes, the Congress disposes. The Congress makes a decision about what those budget numbers will be, what that policy alignment will be. And thankfully, this administration appears to be, and as Jared has described, much more willing than previous administrations to work in a cooperative way with the Congress so that neither one is taking the other by surprise. And they can work together in a harmonious way to come up with the right policy. So that's an important evolution, and I think that's going to be a very significant new development. This panel is going to discuss very briefly some of these emerging policy activities, and then what we want to do is, rather than call it a question and answer period, we want it to be a discussion period in which you all get a chance to make inputs as well as ask for questions to clarify anything that you don't quite understand or want to hear more information about. So you can ask us questions, but also provide feedback, because you've got people here who are at the direct or have a direct access to the highest policy levels in the government. And so you have a chance here to make an input. So with that, I'm going to sit down and introduce the panel, and we'll get started. Thank you. Okay, your program lists Mary Lynn Dittmar on our panel. You'll notice none of these look like the Mary Lynn Dittmar. And Mary Lynn, unfortunately, could not be here. She sends her deep regret for not being able to make it, and her greetings and best wishes for what I can tell you and have said has already been a great conference. Eric Stallmer on the end. Excuse me, too much coffee. Eric Stallmer is the president of the Commercial Spaceflight Federation. CSF is the largest trade organization dedicated to promoting the development of commercial spaceflight. CSF has worked tirelessly to craft modern commercial space launch legislation, as well as to promote innovation as a national policy to spur the economy and create high technology jobs. In addition, CSF works to develop industry standards and encourages further growth in the commercial spaceflight industry. Eric has been recently appointed to the National Space Council User Advisory Group, UAG, where he has provided testimony to the second National Space Council meeting. He also serves as co-chair of the Federal Aviation Administration Airspace Integration Aviation Rulemaking Committee, ARC, and is a member of the Space Launch and Entry ARC and the Spaceport ARC. He's busy. He is also a member of the FAA's Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee. Eric has also served as an officer in the United States Army and Army Reserves, and he was awarded the Bronze Star Medal for meritorious service while engaged in combat operations during Operation Iraqi Freedom. So we thank him especially for that service. James Meyer is the counsel and special advisor to the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Commerce. James got his JD degree from Georgetown University. He was a law clerk in the office of Senator Marco Rubio from December 2012 to January 2014, and then worked as an associate at Jones Day Law Firm before joining the Department of Commerce at the beginning of the Trump administration. James was tasked in February by Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross to deregulate space. His goal is to create an environment that encourages space companies to locate here rather than abroad, to be the flag of choice for space, and to make the current $330 billion space industry a multi-trillion-dollar industry. So he will give you a brief overview of what kind of activities he's doing and the department is doing to help make that a reality. Jared is joining us for part of the Q&A and discussion because he didn't have time during his presentation. And also, if he's like me, he might have some things he wishes he'd said once he got finished talking and he got a chance to do a redo of that. So with that, we'll start with at the far end with with Eric, and then just work our way west. All right, thanks.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Jeff, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Casis, and everyone else, our hosts and sponsors, for being here today. Just to echo what Jared said, it couldn't be a better time. It's really the golden age of space policy, and what we're doing, not just the policy aspect, but everything that we're doing in the space community, just a tremendous amount of excitement. Some of my comments today are going to be overtly biased, and then some will be unbiased, I would say. The biased one I'll delve right into is that I love the space station. I love the work that's going on in the space station, the partners that are involved, the stories that I get to tell when I go out to conferences that are not just space people. Stories about nanoracks and the deployment of satellites that they've done, over 700, I believe, so far. And made in space with additive manufacturing and Casis, what they're doing, and Bigelow and the private sector habitat, and learning about companies like TechShot, and the fantastic things they're doing. So I have a tremendous bias, and I could go on and on. I'd be like an Irish father, trying to name all his kids. So I could go on and on about it. But so with that passion, what we try to do at the Commercial Spaceflight Federation is to promote that passion to Congress, to the executive branch, as they write legislation, as they're authorizing, funding for the future, the outcome of the space station. We want to make sure that the policies that they're putting down are sound. Just recently, the Senate came out with a bill and asked us for a 24-hour turnaround. Gosh, thanks for the notice on that. But we, as an organization, we all kind of coalesced around the bill and said, there's some things here that are good, and there's some things that are glaring that need to be fixed. And I think that's a great role that a trade association plays. I selfishly say this, what CSF does, but Mary Lynn in Abstentia is doing the same thing with the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration, and it's great to be able to partner with her on that. So that was biased. The unbiased thing I will say is that I've never seen the type of cooperation in my 20 plus years of working space policy that I've seen recently with this administration. Historically, the White House, they had the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and you might have known one or two people in that office, and you could, chime into them, but it really didn't go that far. And again, I'm not saying this from a Democrat or Republican perspective. It's just for the last 20 years that was the role. With this administration, within the first 4 or 5 months, they really revved up their involvement in space policy, starting up in September of last year when they announced the National Space Council and the involvement of the Vice President, Scott Pace and Jared, and the involvement not just on pushing these space policy directives out, but opening up the doors to hear what industry wants, what industry's needs are and concerns are, and having a dialogue and a conversation. And that has filtered out to the different agencies. With the new NASA administrator, Jim Bridenstine, a huge space zealot. And it avails himself at all opportunities to talk, what is the role that the commercial industry can play? How can I be helpful? The Secretary of Commerce, you never know where you're going to find your champions, and for years it wasn't at Commerce. But Secretary Wilbur Ross has been nothing short of fantastic. And I'm not saying this just because the Hoya Loya is right next to me, but he has just been fantastic in engaging the commercial sector and taking a leading role and responsibility on what's going on in our industry to help with the regulatory policy, to help reform these pages and pages and stacks of regulations. How do we make this simpler? How do we make it easier for U.S. industry to compete and work in space and be the world leader in space? So it has been fantastic. And then also with the National Space Council, setting up the user advisory group. And I can touch on that a little bit more later, but really trying to get the voice across the board of with a real cross-section of industry and academia and science and technology and researchers. It's a real mixed group, and it's been a real privilege for me to be on it. And again, I say Mary Lynn like she's right here, but to work with Mary Lynn, and then a little later I can talk about some of the committees and the objectives of the user advisory group. But it's a great time right now. There's a tremendous amount of cooperation, and I hope this continues. So I'll turn it over to James on that note.
Sure. So I'm still somewhat new to the space community. I joined Secretary Ross on one of his first days in office and became the regulatory reform officer of the department, kind of a unique new position that the president created at every department to make sure that we are cutting red tape. So while deregulation and cutting red tape are kind of some of my favorite words, really we're bringing a new perspective to regulation. Regulation is not necessarily bad. We just have to regulate in an entirely new way. And at Commerce, we don't view ourselves as a typical regulator, but more of an enabler. And that's what the department really wants to bring to the table. So when the Vice President asked us to remove regulatory burdens on space industry, Secretary Ross called me and kind of gave me the charge. At first I thought, well, there is no regulation in space. That's kind of what makes it so fun. It's like the Wild West out there, and then realized, well, no, indeed, there is significant prohibitive barriers to low-cost access to the market. Obviously, at Commerce, we house NOAA, which regulates remote sensing and use of cameras in space, and we're working very diligently there to try to cut down the processing times of applications. We released an advance notice of a proposed rulemaking last month, and I believe that window for public comment closes on August 27th. And we're very, very much looking forward to seeing all kinds of feedback from industry and our stakeholders on how we can modernize that regulatory framework so that it enables and accommodates rapid innovation and changing technology. That regulatory framework is about 25 years old, and the industry in space today looks significantly different than it did back then. We have all kinds of new uses for cameras, whether it's satellite servicing or marketing or providing customers with proof that their satellite properly separated we've got to find a way to treat certain types of activities differently than cameras that are focused with very strong resolution and can see, your shoelaces from space. Yes, there are some national security concerns, and we have to look out for those and work with our interagency. But at the end of the day, the Department of Defense wants to have its resources properly pointed at things that really are a concern. So remote sensing, we're working hard on that. The window of public comment doesn't close for about another month, but that doesn't mean you can't submit your comments now. I've seen the way this works, and I know we'll get most of the comments the last day, but we're ready to work fast. We've done a lot of prep in advance. We want to turn around a proposed rule as quickly as possible this fall after that window closes. So please, do a thorough job getting us your feedback. We want that, but the faster you go, the faster government can go to help you. As far as regulatory reform at the department, we're also doing a major consolidation and coordination of functions. The day that Space Policy Directive 2 was signed, charging Commerce to create a one-stop shop within the department, we sent a notice of our proposed new space administration to Congress. It will relocate the Office of Space Commerce and the Commercial Remote Sensing Regulatory Affairs Office up within the Office of the Secretary to get the top-level attention that those offices really need if we are going to create this new economy and this new demand in space. That office will also be prepared for additional responsibilities that arise, one being space traffic management, which was the topic of Space Policy Directive 2. Commerce was charged to be the lead civil agency interface for coordination of space traffic, and we're excited to get underway with that responsibility. A lot of people have been asking, well, why is Commerce doing this? And it's really quite an easy answer. People don't always think of commerce when they think of space, but the reality is, for one reason or another, we touch on commercial space activity in so many different ways. From the Bureau of Industry and Security's licensing of exports. We're working hard on an export control reform project. We've got NTIA that manages spectrum allocation. We've got the International Trade Administration that advocates for billions of dollars of deals for our U.S. space companies around the world. NOAA is kind of the leader in space observation and data collection and helps provide the data to industry to enable people to properly navigate their objects in space and avoid problems. And we've got NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, that's going to be a very critical resource for us as we start to look at best practices and standards for space traffic coordination. So do we have all of the experts in place, the technical leaders that are going to be ready to handle this? Not quite. We're working on that quickly. But at the end of the day, we feel very confident that we're going to be able to have a seamless transition with the Department of Defense to really help the budding space industry. We've got about 800 American satellites in space right now, and in 5 years, that number is going to be about 15,000. So things are about to absolutely boom in a good way, and the Department of Commerce looks forward to being the agency that's going to help advocate for industry, remove barriers as they arise, and be your friend around the world as we try to find new market entrants and new needs for space servicing. It's been exciting to meet a lot of the people in this room at multiple events, and I've started to notice that the space community is somewhat insulated. And I think if we're really going to reach that next step where we can subsidize a lot more government R&D, take the weight off the taxpayers, reach new heights, and develop all kinds of new service needs, we've got to bring more people into the conversation. So that's the Secretary's big priority going into the next 6 months. We want to have a big summit at Commerce this fall that's going to bring in the lenders and big finance institutions that have not always been part of the conversation. We've got some great billionaire entrepreneurs that are taking us to new heights, and that's wonderful. But if we're going to fund some of these deeper space initiatives, we need those big banks in the room, and the Secretary knows that language very well. And we're going to be reaching out to different participants in industry that haven't been part of the conversation as well. They don't even know what services are out there, and we want to connect everybody together. So that's kind of the big overview, and look forward to the questions.
Thanks. Jared, anything you want to add to previous comments before we go to questions?
I think probably the only thing I would add is just to associate myself with Eric's comments about the teamwork that is involved in the policy development process. The National Space Council works off of an interagency working group process that drives consensus through the interagency to make sure that whatever policies are coming out, whatever policy we're working on, that we have all the right people in the room, that we have the right agency partners all sitting at the table and giving their perspectives on what they think is the right way to go. The Users Advisory Group that was just recently set up with Chairman Admiral Ellis at the head has been really, really fantastic having him there and being able to pull all of the various industry players together. We're really looking forward to continuing to work with the UAG and seeing the types of things that are going to come out of that. But for us, the policy development process is very much a team effort. It's something that we really rely on our industry partners. We rely on people like James over at Commerce and folks at the Department of Transportation and DoD to really help us make sure that we're not just getting to what's the most expedient policy, but what is the best policy. And sometimes that means it takes a while. The Space Traffic Management Space Policy Directive 3 was about 7 months of interagency meetings every 2 weeks to pull that policy together. So it's sometimes it takes longer, sometimes it's harder. It takes a lot more of our time, but I think in the end, when we get to a policy consensus that all the departments can support, and the industry recognizes this is not just one person over at the White House that thinks this is a good idea. This is something that everybody has come together on and coalesced around. I think ultimately it ends up being better for the country and better for the industry. So yeah, that's all I got.
All right, thanks to all of you for that input. I don't know if this is on or not, but one thing I want to add to, I did get that chance to think of things I should have said. But in the introduction, Jim mentioned several times that I led the Republican staff in doing the different things that we did. And I want to make it very clear that was to help highlight the fact that I was just one part of the equation. The other part of the equation was the Democrat staff. And throughout the entire time at the committee, I worked very closely with my Democratic counterparts, first Chan Liu and then Ann Zolkowski. And so you can substitute their names for any of those accomplishments as well as mine, because we were definitely a team effort. We worked closely together. That's been one of the beauties of space policy, has been its bipartisan basis. And all of those NASA authorization bills were passed by, all of them were unanimously passed in the Senate and were passed by huge majorities in the House. So space is for everybody, and the members of Congress recognize that, and they reflect that in their votes. It wasn't always the case, but it is the case now, and I think we can ensure that it is the case going forward. So I did want to make that point as well. So now let's turn to you for some inputs and conversation, and talk about what do you think the major challenges are? What questions do you have to clarify anything that you've heard just now? But what do you think the major issues are with respect to, say, the future of ISS, the low Earth orbit, the role of NASA versus the commercial role, the kind of things you just heard described as being the subject matter of the current policy evaluation process. And so that's where we're looking to see policies developed, and now's the chance to get your inputs on that. So don't all speak at once, but so raise your hands. I don't know who. I can barely see folks, but do we have a mic to go around? Okay, I see it. Talk loudly when you raise your question. I see a tentative hand over here.
Okay. In terms of fostering LEO commercialization, space development in earnest, arguably a key element of that is being able to support the development of the necessary utilities, the development of necessary utilities such as electrical power, ancillary services, navigation, time throughout cislunar space. which is arguably from the Kármán line at 100 kilometers through to the surface of the moon. Being able to have a policy framework that encourages those, those essential services throughout cislunar space could make an extraordinary difference. The question comes in is there something that could be done from your folks' perspective to hasten that coming to pass?
Okay. Any feedback on that?
Sure. I can give a great example right off the bat. From the directives, NASA received a task to work with the Departments of Commerce and State to find new commercial opportunities in low Earth orbit. And I can tell you it's been a great surprise when I got into this area. Everybody told me that NASA and Commerce, we're not going to really jive. But we've had a terrific open working relationship. I know they've got a report that they're working on, and they're welcoming our inputs to find ways to, give commercial a chance. We can't have the government be an unnecessary competitor when the private sector can do things faster and cheaper and more effectively, and we've got to bring more people into the market. Obviously, the government is going to continue to be the biggest customer. I'm not going to pretend that that's not the case, but if we're going to lead to more private sector deals, we've got to bring more people in and just give them an opportunity, and that's what we see our role as at Commerce.
Just to add on to that, and wearing the UAG hat right now, I think what the Space Council is looking for from the UAG is when we have these field hearings, when we have the different meetings and we've broken down into the different subcommittees, to hear what concerns and what areas should we be addressing, and policy areas that could be innovative and fruitful to promoting our space industry. And I think what you're going to see, and hopefully you'll reach out to the advisory group on these issues so we can help shape and formulate these policies so we can elevate this to the National Space Council level. And I think we're seeing that, and as Jared highlighted earlier, just in the just recent last few months, the concerns of the microgravity community, whether it's suborbital or orbital, what those concerns were, and then what kind of pushed that to come up with a policy. And then as they're shaping this policy, to reach out and listen to the microgravity community. So I think the system is working, and I think they're looking for that kind of input.
Thanks. And next, anyone else?
Is this on yet? There we are. Alan DeLuna with the AAS.
Where are you?
One of the developing capabilities is horizontal launch, and that's going to give us some flexibility that we don't normally have with vertical launch. Now, horizontal launch is governed by the FAA in the United States, but it's also governed by the FAA when a U.S. company does horizontal launch offshore. Those other countries also have their own versions of the FAA, and Europe has its version of the FAA, whose rules are tending to be much more restrictive than our FAA rules even are. Is there anything being done to look at how to establish a consistent regulatory regimen on things such as horizontal launch of orbital vehicles, horizontal launch of space tourism vehicles, create a consistent regulatory regime that would address one set of rules for all countries?
Any comments on the horizontal launch issue? Or?
So I'm sorry, we're having a hard time hearing with the speakers, but I think I got the gist of the question, that trying to find consistency across the regulatory regimes for vertical and horizontal launch. So Space Policy Directive 2, one of the requirements in SPD2 is for the Department of Transportation to reform all of their launch and reentry regulations, and we kind of, the Space Policy Directive, the way that it's written, kind of defines the box. These are the things that you need to do, and here are a little bit of guidance on what to do inside the box. But then we're really counting on the department to work with industry to find the best answers, the best solutions, to make sure that that environment that they're creating provides the best opportunity possible for the industry to succeed. I think we saw in the run-up to Space Policy Directive 2 is that organizations like Eric's were really constantly coming to the White House, OSTP, the departments, and saying, the regulatory systems that we have are woefully out of date. They were written before most of our member companies were even around, and the systems just don't match the current state of the technology. And so we went back to the departments and said, okay, so how do we make this work better so that our regulatory environment matches what is actually happening in the industry? And that's how we came to Space Policy Directive 2. And so what the directive says is that they need to be focused on performance-based regulations as opposed to prescriptive-based regulations. So rather than saying you need to turn the wrench X many times on this one particular screw, they say, here's what the screw should do. We don't care how many times you have to turn it. And so that's a different way of looking at regulatory systems than had been in the past. But the vertical versus horizontal launch thing actually brings in another element to it, which is the aviation side of the FAA. And the FAA has obviously a very long history of regulating airspace. It's given us the safest aviation system in the world. And that's a really important thing to remember, that the FAA, although they have a lot of involvement in the operations of aircraft, it is the safest airspace system in the world. So finding a way to balance some of the concerns that the aviation community has with some of the concerns that the space community has is a challenge for the department, to be sure. I think Eric can probably talk a little bit more about that, because he sits on the aviation rulemaking committees that are looking at some of this stuff, the airspace access and some of those other things. But.
Yeah, if I can dovetail a little bit what Jared said, and as Jeff went over the list of many unpaid committees involvement that I belong to, the aviation rulemaking committees are one of them, and they've really, the experience I've had, and I think it goes to the heart, a little bit of the heart of your question. The administration said, as Jared said, look at these regulations. What do we need to improve on? What can we get rid of? And about two months ago, and I'm looking at Tommy to see if I'm right, about 2 months ago we did this airspace launch and reentry regulatory reform working group. And we worked very, very closely with the FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation, actually the larger FAA, and came back with 150 pages of recommendations. That sounds like a lot, but that just goes to show how many pages of regulatory laws and issues that there were. So it was very effective, and we submitted that to the FAA, where now they're taking a look and trying to implement this, and I think the White House gave them a timeline of February 1st to come back with these recommendations and improvements. The other one, and as Jared was touching base on, is the airspace integration issue. And the challenge and melding these two different communities, the aviation community and the launch community, the aviation community kind of said, hey, we've got an issue. Every time there's a launch that takes off from Florida, you're closing the airspace for, anywhere up to 4 hours, and this huge area of operation you're closing. And they cited an example of a recent launch that impacted 500 flights. And so we started engaging with the aviation community. And what we learned was there's a lot of education that needed to be done on both parts. The airline said, hey, we have a solution. Why don't you guys just launch, Sunday at 2 a.m. in the morning, and it won't affect any of us. And then we had to talk about orbital mechanics and things like that. But the challenge is that a good year will maybe launch 30 times a year. The airlines take off and land about 40,000 times a day. So I sometimes ask, who's really the problem here on this integration? And then also there's a question of prioritization. I don't like that word in this context, because prioritization means that somebody's first, somebody's second, and somebody's third. So what we're trying to do is come up with a solution of this integration of the airspace. It's, we only have so much, critical amount of national airspace. So how do we optimize the use of this airspace? And I think we're kind of coming to a better understanding of what each community does. And a lot of it comes down to technology and ingesting the technology that's out there and not the outdated systems that they're using. So when a launch takes off, you don't have to close the airspace. For instance, Blue Origin launched last week. The whole operation, maybe from takeoff to landing, which is great to say, but maybe 20 minutes total. They notified the FAA that they launched, the vehicle returned, they had a successful re-entry, and the airspace is wide open. Well, it took the FAA 4 hours to open up that airspace in West Texas. That's a problem, and that's what the airlines get upset about, and that's understandable. So how do we shrink down that time and shrink down that area of operation in the safest and most effective way? So that's one of the rocks in my duffel bag these days, and it's open to any suggestions from anyone. So.
Good stuff.
Okay, we have a question from the app to Jeff. What are the key barriers and enablers that will ensure continuity of human spaceflight?
I can't hear that with the speakers, unfortunately. Can you?
Okay. What are the key barriers and enablers that will ensure continuity of human spaceflight?
Okay, did you get that? Barriers that would ensure continuity to human spaceflight?
I think she's asking you.
I didn't know.
Yeah. I heard Jeff.
I heard Jeff. I think she's asking you.
missed that part. Well, I think the chief barrier is communication among the policymakers and the people with the problems. The kind of forum we're trying to do here, the thing that the Space Council is doing with respect to opening up itself to inputs from the user advisory group. Too often we have problems that go without solutions because nobody communicates to the right people at the right time in the right way what exactly that problem is. And so communication is important. I think that's what's, to me, most exciting about what the council is offering in this new incarnation is a whole new dimension of that, not only to the public and back and forth and to the user community, but also to the Hill and back and forth, so we don't have surprises. In the past, excuse me, I was part of the synthesis group back in 1990, and which was intended by the then National Space Council to provide, a plan to go back to the moon and Mars. And we came up with 4 different architectures, spent a lot of time pulling that all together, and then at the last minute, when it was ready to be sent to the Congress, somebody reported that it was going to cost $500 billion. Well, even though that was over a 20-year period, members of Congress look at $500 billion as today's money, and so it was dead on arrival because there'd been no communication, there had been no advance notification, there'd been no